Doubt sticks with you when you're pushed to take drastic actions. What choices could have kept me out of this mess? What decisions might have saved me from this hole I'd found myself in? I felt pretty sure I didn't have a lot of options left. How do you make an adult see that their actions might destroy everything they care about? You can't push them into realizing it. You're just left standing by, helpless, forced to deal with whatever disaster might come. That's exactly where I found myself. My wife, who once seemed so loving and steady, was convinced that all of this would somehow bring us closer together, prove that our love was strong and deep. But to me, it felt like it was proving the opposite, exposing how shallow her love was, highlighting her self-centeredness and indulgence. I'm just an average guy, living a regular life. I'm no knight in shining armor, no hopeless romantic. Like anyone else, I've got my flaws. I can be selfish, I'm absorbed in work, and sometimes I get mad over nothing. I don't do it on purpose. It's just part of being human. Life has its way of throwing us curveballs, and sometimes routines get disrupted. Ariana and I have been married for 19 years, and we've shared a good intimacy a couple of times a week. It was always enjoyable, and we were both more than willing whenever we could make the time. Hobbies, watching football, getting into a good book, binging a show. Raising our kids and balancing everything else sometimes pulled us away from each other, but we made the time when it really mattered. Our marriage was steady, finances were improving, and our daughters, Elena and Serena, who are now 16 and 14, brought us so much happiness. I might be an ordinary guy, but they were extraordinary and life was going well, until Ariana started getting these out-of-the-box ideas. She called our love life vanilla and insisted we needed to spice things up. I'd been content with how things were, but I was willing to go along with her ideas, at least for a while. We tried different positions, which I didn't mind since I'm in decent shape, but the excitement faded after a bit. Then she brought up role-playing, something that just felt awkward and a little forced to me. I couldn't wrap my head around where she was getting these ideas. Was it her friends? Some article in a magazine? Or maybe something she'd seen on TV? We gave it a shot, and it was fun for a while, but eventually it started feeling silly trying to imagine I was Leonardo DiCaprio while she pretended to be Scarlett Johansson. It was exhausting, and I told her I was done. That's when she got upset. She asked when the last time was that I'd gone on a date. I laughed and reminded her that just last Friday we'd gone out to that new Italian place she wanted to try, caught a movie, and her mom had watched the kids for the night. She shook her head and clarified that she didn't mean with her. She wanted to know when I'd last been out with someone else. I was shocked and asked if she was accusing me of something. She quickly denied it, saying she just wondered if I remembered the name of the last girl I went out with before her. I told her it was a girl named Lana, and that was that, or at least I thought it was. About 2 weeks after we first started dating, we got into a big argument about that date. Out of nowhere, she asked if I ever missed it, the dating scene, that is. I just laughed and said, God, no. Dating was awful. It wasn't the date itself, which had gone fine, but everything else. Asking someone out, worrying about being turned down, the uncomfortable small talk. All of it felt so stressful and nerve-wracking. Curious, she asked why this even came up, and I turned the question back on her, asking if she ever felt like going out with someone else. She looked me straight in the eye and promised she'd never wanted that, then reminded me how upset she was when I'd gone out with Lana before we got together. She had wanted us to be exclusive from the start. I told her I'd felt the same and wouldn't have proposed if I didn't want a committed relationship. To me, marriage meant leaving dating behind. She nodded and dropped it, and I thought that was the end of it. Then, about a month later on a Friday night, we just made love. No costumes, no gimmicks, just the two of us, close and content. I'd had a couple of intense moments, and she'd reached her peak several times. We were lying there, relaxed and basking in the afterglow, and that's when she brought something up that killed the whole vibe. Out of nowhere, Ariana mentioned that her coworker Mila had been eyeing me at a work event and hinted that Mila might like it if I asked her to dance. I chuckled, told her it was flattering, but that I only wanted to dance with her. Ariana, though, seemed unfazed and casually said she'd told Mila she wouldn't be jealous if I danced with her. I thanked her for being so understanding, but assured her I had zero plans to dance with anyone but her. She then got a little bolder, asking if I'd mind if she danced with another man. I tried to lighten the moment by joking, "Sure, maybe your brother?" But she didn't laugh. Instead, she clarified that she didn't mind if I danced with women as long as they kept it respectful. She even asked if there was anyone in particular I'd wanted to dance with that night. I shrugged, told her I didn't remember anyone asking, and she seemed satisfied enough with that answer, though I had no clue where this line of questioning was heading. It was just odd, and left me feeling a bit uneasy. Later, after lying in bed wide awake for an hour, I finally got up, went to the den, and started playing a video game to clear my head. A while later, she came to the doorway, watching me for a moment, but I didn't look over. Eventually, she turned back to bed, and I joined her only after she'd fallen asleep. Things were quiet on the subject for another 2 months, until her promotion party at the Monroe Rhino, where they'd hired a fantastic band. We were sitting in this huge booth, Ariana talking to Mila, and at some point, Ariana casually mentioned that Mila wanted to dance. She looked at me and asked if I'd be a gentleman and dance with her friend. I remembered our conversation from months ago, and the request made me feel awkward. Mila was a good friend, and I didn't want to embarrass her, but I really didn't want to dance with her either. Just the thought of her close like that, feeling the beat of the music with me, made me uncomfortable. I like dancing, sure, but not like that, and I was stumped on how to politely turn it down. Feeling trapped, I stood up, trying to hide my discomfort, and muttered something about how I thought they were playing our song. Mila joined me on the dance floor, her brown thighs catching my eye below her short blue dress. As the song ended, the band switched to a slow number, and I inwardly groaned. Why now? Mila's body fit against mine almost too perfectly, her chest pressed up against me, her dark curls close enough to brush my face. She had this soft, pleasant scent, and when she looked up, her big brown eyes almost melted me with their warmth. She had this coffee-colored complexion that made her look like a living, breathing sunset. When the song finally ended, Mila smiled and thanked me, mentioning that Ariana had assured her I wouldn't mind the dance. I managed to return the compliment, saying she was a great dancer but admitted, honestly, that I actually did mind a bit. I told her I thought she was sweet, but that dancing like that with her felt a little too close for comfort. Mila chuckled, assuring me I was safe with her, and even joked that if I weren't married, she'd be all over me. She added that she valued our friendship and thought it was best if we just enjoyed that one dance as a one-time thing. I gave her a small squeeze as we wrapped up the song. As we walked back to the booth, though, Ariana was nowhere to be found. I scanned the room, finally spotting her across the dance floor, chatting it up with some tall, blonde guy who looked like he belonged on a Viking ship. His hands were a little too low on her waist for my liking. She caught my gaze, smiled, and waved like nothing was out of the ordinary. A surge of anger hit me. Had she set this whole thing up, pushing me to dance with Mila just so she could flirt with this guy? Fed up, I tossed a couple of 20s on the table and headed toward the exit. Mila noticed and, looking confused, chased after me, catching up near the door, slightly out of breath. She asked where I was going, and I told her bluntly that we'd been played. Ariana had been dropping hints about seeing other people for weeks, using me as an excuse so she could dance with that guy. Mila asked if I was really just going to leave Ariana there, and I nodded, saying I was done with her games. She grabbed my arm, apologized, and admitted she hadn't realized the full extent of Ariana's intentions. I told her I didn't blame her and offered her a ride home so she could get her car. As we got close to my house, my phone buzzed, but I ignored it. Mila looked over at me as her phone rang, though, and she answered it. It was Ariana. Mila calmly told her we were almost at my house, explaining it wasn't her idea to leave her behind. I heard her tell Ariana she didn't appreciate being dragged into this mess, and that she wasn't about to be stranded herself. After a moment, she hung up and turned to me, saying Ariana now wanted me to go back and pick her up. I shook my head, sighing in frustration, venting about Ariana's immature games and wondering what had gotten into her. Mila seemed sympathetic and mentioned that a coworker of theirs, Sophie, had been talking a lot about her open marriage and how she claimed it had improved her relationship. Mila guessed Ariana had been influenced by Sophie's stories. Mila explained that Ariana's interest in this open relationship idea was inspired by their coworker Sophie and her husband Liam, who barely spoke to each other but spent their free time trying to rope friends into their lifestyle. Mila said she believed Ariana had fallen for it. And, to my shock, Mila added that Ariana was well aware Mila had always found me attractive. I almost choked and immediately apologized, feeling bad for Mila getting dragged into this mess. Mila admitted she did find me attractive, but she wasn't interested in this sort of situation. She preferred one partner and wasn't one to share. She reassured me that she had nothing to do with Ariana's plans. I promised to keep her in the loop, and after a sympathetic look, she left in her car. When I got inside, I took my things from the master bathroom and moved them to the guest room, grabbing my work files too. I locked the door and went to sleep, probably helped by the drinks I'd had earlier. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was half awakened by the sound of the front door slamming and footsteps coming down the hall. The doorknob rattled a couple of times, followed by a light knock. I heard Ariana whispering softly, trying not to wake the kids, asking if I was awake and what was going on. For about 10 minutes, she tapped on the door, whispering in that same pleading tone, but eventually, she gave up and went back to the master bedroom. Oddly, the guest bed felt pretty uncomfortable, and I wasn't sleeping well anyway. In the morning, I tried to get out of the house before she woke up, but no such luck. As I was packing up some files, she came downstairs, looking frustrated and demanding to know what was wrong with me. I didn't hold back. I told her she should be asking herself that question. She looked confused and angry, raising her voice and demanding to know what I meant by that. I picked up my briefcase and told her that everything I was doing was in response to her behavior. Right now, I didn't even want to look at her, and if she kept pushing, she'd risk making me permanently angry. I said she'd better get herself together and be ready to talk when I got home later. I also mentioned I'd be picking up the girls from school and bringing them to my mom's for the evening so we could talk things through without them around. Her face went pale, and she stammered that she didn't know what I was talking about, hinting she might have had plans for the night. I told her it was her choice. If she wanted to fix things, she needed to stop making excuses and be ready when I got back. And if she was fine with how things were, then she could do whatever she wanted. I finished by saying she should move her things into the spare room because I planned to keep my bed for myself from now on. She started to argue, but I turned and left for work. That afternoon, I picked up the girls from school, and they were happy to spend the evening with their grandma. I told Mom that Ariana and I were going through some things and needed some time alone to work it out. She gave me a big hug and told me she loved me, which made me feel grateful I didn't have to explain everything. When I got back home, Ariana was there waiting, acting like nothing unusual had happened. She'd even baked cookies, and there was a fresh plate of them and a cup of coffee waiting for me on the counter. She hugged me briefly, kissed my cheek, and sat down beside me on the sofa. I picked up one of the cookies she'd made, oatmeal with chocolate chips and M&Ms. It felt like a small attempt at reconciliation, and part of me didn't want to spoil the peace. But I took a deep breath and told her directly that I was still upset about what had happened the night before. I explained that her actions had hurt me, embarrassed both of us, and disrespected Mila, who was supposed to be her friend. Ariana struggled to meet my gaze and muttered an apology, clearly uncomfortable. Reflecting on the night, I realized I could have approached things differently too. I explained that my goal wasn't just to criticize her, but to open up a line of communication. I felt like she'd been shutting me down lately, and I thought that bringing this up directly might get her to consider other perspectives. When I asked what had been going through her mind, she hesitated, then blurted out that she'd been thinking about dating other people. I was floored. I reminded her that there were some major problems with that idea, starting with the fact that we were both married. She responded, saying other married couples do it and claimed open marriages actually strengthen relationships. I raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, and asked if she could give me any examples. She brought up Sophie and Liam again, insisting that their open marriage had improved their connection. Not entirely convinced, I suggested we look up some statistics to see what the numbers said about open marriages. A little surprised, she agreed, so I pulled out my laptop. I typed in how many people have open marriages and clicked the first link that popped up. The results were clear. Less than 1% of Americans are in open marriages. We checked a few other sources to confirm, and they all showed the same low percentage. Ariana looked taken aback but quickly said that even so, that still represented millions of people. I raised a counterpoint, suggesting we search for how many Americans expect their partners to be faithful. The results came back showing that over 95% of Americans expect monogamy in their relationships. I turned to her and asked what she made of that. She sighed, saying it probably meant that most people weren't open-minded. She admitted she thought open relationships were more common because she seemed to hear about them so often. Then, I posed another question: how many open marriages end in divorce? She seemed reluctant, but I insisted, and we found the statistic: 92% of open marriages end in divorce within 5 years. I broke it down to put things in perspective. So, let's say out of 1 million people, fewer than 10,000 are in open marriages. If 92% of those end in divorce, that means only 800 out of those 10,000 will still be together after 5 years. That's 800 out of 1 million. I looked at Ariana, asking her to seriously think about the odds of success for an open marriage. When I pointed out that 92% of 1% failing meant the odds were stacked against her, she finally admitted that the chances didn't look too promising. I added that the few open marriages that did work were ones where both partners were genuinely on board. But here's the kicker: I told her that 100% of marriages where one partner is pressured into it fail. In our case, she'd be dragging me into something I wasn't willing to do, which would inevitably lead to resentment, jealousy, and insecurity. I reassured her that I wasn't desperate enough to keep her under those conditions, and that I knew other women found me attractive, so this wasn't about insecurity. If I were desperate or weak, maybe I'd go along with this game, I said, but I'm not that man. I'd rather you shoot me in the head than break my heart like that. Ariana tried to argue weakly that not everything on the internet is true. I acknowledged that, saying I knew there was plenty of misinformation out there, especially when it came to topics like open marriages. But then I asked her, do you believe everything Sophie says? You know she's been divorced multiple times, right? When she didn't seem to know that about Sophie, I decided to look it up myself and discovered Sophie had actually been divorced 4 times. I couldn't hold back my shock. You're taking marriage advice from someone who's failed at it 4 times? I said. She tried to defend Sophie, saying that she and her current husband, Liam, seemed to have a strong marriage. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check, and asked where all this was coming from. Ariana admitted that Sophie frequently talked about it, and it sounded refreshing and exciting. She then explained that Sophie and Liam barely communicated in a traditional sense, spending their time trying to connect with others. I looked at her, completely baffled, and asked, how do you see that ending well? Ariana seemed to hesitate, then suggested that maybe our own sex life had grown stale. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her flat out that I was happy with our intimacy. I pointed out that her insistence on role-playing had actually made things feel awkward and even reminded her how she'd climaxed 6 times the last time we were together. Then I asked, did all these ideas come from Sophie? Her guilty expression told me all I needed to know. I couldn't hold back my frustration anymore. Our marriage is solid, I told her. I don't see why you're trying to complicate it with this nonsense. She argued that it might be exciting to try new experiences, to share more. I told her bluntly that her idea sounded like a nightmare, not a fantasy. When she tried to bring up men supposedly fantasizing about this, I challenged her to actually look that up. You'll find that most men aren't interested in watching their wives with someone else, I said. Then I made it clear that if she went any further down this path, our relationship would be over. Ariana looked stunned and asked what I meant by over. She seemed genuinely shaken, as though she'd never considered that it might lead to divorce. She said she believed our marriage meant more than that. I told her I was just as disappointed, especially if she could throw away everything we'd built over some notion she'd picked up from a coworker who could hardly keep a marriage herself. I asked her if she'd thought about what she'd tell our daughters if we split up. When she started to suggest it would be because I couldn't accept her choices, I stopped her cold. No, I said firmly. The truth would be that their mother chose other relationships over her family. I told her that if she couldn't love me enough to honor her vows and provide stability for our family, then she was putting her own desires ahead of the well-being of everyone involved. Our tempers rose, and that's when she crossed a line, claiming that she'd go through with it anyway, that it was inevitable. I felt a chill, but I kept my voice steady as I warned her that if she pursued this path, our marriage would not survive it. I would consult a lawyer immediately. Then I gave her a choice. Either forget about this nonsense and work on saving our marriage, or we'd go our separate ways and start the divorce process right now. I suggested therapy, thinking maybe she could figure out what was driving these irrational ideas, though I honestly doubted she'd follow through. I laid the blame squarely on Sophie's influence, telling her nothing good would come from following in her footsteps. "I'm not just going to sit here and watch you ruin our family," I said. I demanded to know her intentions and challenged her to consider the damage she was about to cause. But she taunted me instead, declaring that she had the freedom to do as she pleased and that there was nothing I could do to stop her. She even threatened me, saying I wouldn't dare divorce her because I'd end up losing everything. She'd take the girls, the house, and leave me buried in alimony and child support. Trying to keep my voice calm, I told her to think carefully and not make any rash decisions. Despite all her claims of love, I couldn't see anything in this proposal but a disaster waiting to happen. When I made it clear that I was serious, that this idea of hers was non-negotiable, she walked over and tried to embrace me, leaning in to kiss me. I put my hands up and gently pushed her back, telling her, "Don't touch me. I need time to think about this." It wasn't the truth. I didn't need time to think. I needed time to plan. She was probably right about the financial risks and complications of divorce, and I knew I had to make smart moves if it came to that. I left her standing there and went to the master bedroom, locking the door behind me. I spent hours on my computer and on the phone, setting up a financial plan to protect myself. The real concern, though, was the girls. Under Georgia law, where we lived in Atlanta, children over 14 can choose which parent they want to live with. Serena, my youngest and a true daddy's girl, would likely stay with me. But Elena, my older daughter, was a different story. She loved me, but she adored her mother, too. A part of me hated what I was considering, but I thought that if I explained Ariana's intentions, that she was willing to use them as pawns in her pursuit of an open marriage, they'd both see what kind of choices their mother was making and want nothing to do with it. I knew it was a harsh tactic, but I wasn't the one who'd changed the rules. If Ariana had told me before we got married that she'd want to explore other relationships after 19 years, I'd have walked away. She knew that, and she would have done the same. But now she was trying to rewrite the rules and using emotional blackmail to force me into compliance. 2 nights later, we had another conversation. Ariana began with an apology, but I could barely bring myself to listen. I suggested we see a therapist, maybe look into marriage counseling. She brushed it off, denying she had any issues, and even twisted things, claiming I was the one who wanted to be with other women. The irony was almost laughable. I pointed out the contradiction, and she backtracked, saying she wasn't actually planning anything. She just wanted us to keep the option open. That's when I laid out my side, explaining that I'd had opportunities too, but had always chosen our marriage over any temptations. Over the years, I'd had chances to cheat, but I'd stayed loyal, driven by a commitment I believed we both shared. I reminded Ariana that a successful marriage takes effort and planning, and I told her outright that her actions now showed a lack of that commitment. I couldn't help but question how she'd let down not just me, but also our children and even the vows we'd made before God. She got defensive, and when I asked how she thought the girls would view this betrayal, she warned me not to bring them into it. Later that day, after more tense words, she hit me with a threat. As their mother, she'd get full custody of the kids and make my visitation rights a living nightmare. I couldn't believe she'd go so far, but her tone left no room for doubt. We had a heated exchange, and she stormed off, slamming the door so loud I knew anyone nearby would hear. A faint gasp and a stifled sob drifted from upstairs, and I suddenly realized the girls might have overheard everything. I went to check, first stopping by Serena's room and then moving to Elena's, where I heard them whispering. I knocked softly, and Elena opened the door. They both had red, tear-streaked faces. I sat down between them, wrapped my arms around them, and told them how sorry I was that they'd had to hear all of this. You wouldn't have believed me if you hadn't heard it yourselves, I said, feeling a weight lift from having them know the truth. Elena looked up at me and said, "It's not your fault, Dad." She placed the blame squarely on her mom, admitting she hadn't believed me at first, but now understood. Serena, her voice quivering, asked how their mother could do something like this to us, to her family. I told them I didn't understand it myself, that she seemed to be influenced by negative people from work. I explained how I tried to reason with her and that my efforts to keep our family together had fallen on deaf ears. Serena's voice grew soft. "Do you think Mom's sick?" I shook my head, honestly unsure what to think anymore. I told her I'd suggested therapy and marriage counseling, but Ariana didn't want any part of it. Serena looked at me, worry in her eyes, and asked what they should do now. I told them they didn't need to do anything, not yet. I explained that I'd be waiting for Ariana to make the next move, which I fully expected would be her going out with someone else. When that day came, I told them we'd be ready to leave. I was done trying to change her mind. I knew it was a lost cause. Looking at each of them, I asked if they were with me or if they wanted to stay with their mother. Serena exchanged a long look with Elena before saying, "No, Dad, we're going with you." Hearing those words felt like a lifeline in a storm. After 19 years of disappointment, the support of my daughters gave me a sense of strength and purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next 2 months, Ariana and I barely spoke. We drifted around the house like strangers, her in the spare bedroom and me in our old room. I made several attempts to reach out, hoping to dissuade her, but our conversations were clipped and full of tension. Felt like we were just roommates, each marking time. One evening, while we were working in the garden, I decided to try one last time. "Is this really what you want?" I asked, leaning on the shovel and meeting her gaze. I looked at Ariana, asking if she'd found that passionate, exciting relationship she'd envisioned. Was all of this as fulfilling as she'd imagined? For a brief second, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes, but it quickly turned to anger. She fired back, blaming me for everything, insisting that I was the one who had created this mess. I told her again that I couldn't support her plans to explore with other people, making it clear I wanted no part of it. But she snapped back, saying I was the one standing in the way. In the heat of our argument, she practically yelled that I needed to see the bright side and let go of my stubborn pride. I asked her what exactly this perfect situation would look like and who it was supposed to benefit. From where I stood, the idea of perfection was nowhere in sight, especially not for me. I challenged her claim that she loved me more, pointing out that real love doesn't look like this. I told her that true love, to me, meant staying faithful, giving her freedom within the marriage but never crossing certain lines. Her desire to push these boundaries felt selfish, not loving. "When did you stop loving me?" I asked. She teared up, claiming her love had only grown stronger. I shook my head, telling her that her actions felt like a knife through my heart. Her face twisted in frustration, and she suddenly announced that she planned to go to a club with a coworker, Jack Monroe, on Friday night. Then she dropped a bombshell. She insisted I come along, promising it would be a fun experience. Reluctantly, I agreed, figuring that if she was determined to do this, I might as well be there to see where it was headed. She rushed over and hugged me tightly, thanking me for my willingness to join her. But as I stood there, I could already feel a deep sense of regret settling in, and I knew I'd need support to get through this. I decided to call Mila. When I told Mila about the plan, she was livid. She had no idea that she'd been used as part of Ariana's scheme to pull me into a clubbing scene with her and Jack Monroe. Furious, she vowed to confront Ariana, saying she'd never have agreed to go if she'd known the full picture. I asked Mila for her support and trust, explaining that I needed her help in what was shaping up to be a critical moment for me. I was seriously planning to leave Ariana, and I needed someone who understood. At first, Mila sounded skeptical, unsure if she could trust my intentions. But after I explained my plan, to pretend to go along with Ariana's idea just long enough to see where it would lead, she began to understand. I asked if she could play along for one night and come home with me afterward. Mila hesitated for a moment, then let out a laugh, asking if I was using this as a ploy to get her alone at my house. I laughed too, admitting that yes, in a way it was a scheme, but one with a much bigger purpose. I explained to Mila that I needed her help moving the girls to my new place while I went back to the house to retrieve our belongings. Surprisingly, she seemed to enjoy the vengeful aspect of the plan and readily agreed to help. Throughout the week leading up to Friday, Ariana acted unusually affectionate, as if savoring every moment. On Friday morning, just before I left for work, I asked her one last time if she was sure about her decision, reminding her that she could still back out. I pointed out how enjoyable the past week had been, hoping she might reconsider. But she was firm, assuring me we'd talk about it afterward if needed. She even thanked me for going along with her plan, promising that the night ahead would be the best yet. Watching her flit out of the bedroom, I thought bitterly, she really thinks I'm going to love this. When Friday evening finally rolled around, Mila arrived, and she looked absolutely stunning. Ariana was cute and petite, with a youthful face and a slender build, but Mila was something else entirely. Tall and curvy, with a figure that would turn heads, she was dressed in a short, sequined red sheath dress that hugged her in all the right places. I wore a sport coat over a ribbed t-shirt with black pants, and as Mila walked in, she glanced at me with a grin, teasingly suggesting that I looked ready to seduce her. I laughed, clarifying that tonight was strictly business and reserved for another time. She smirked, mentioning that she was wearing a thong, thinking it might be to my liking. Amused, I playfully told her to show me, my hands teasing the hem of her dress as I lifted it just a bit. She giggled, cautioning that Ariana could walk in any second. But I leaned in, saying Ariana needed to think I was fully on board with her little game. We shared a laugh, enjoying the moment, but just as I was about to get a better view, Ariana suddenly entered the room. Mila quickly adjusted her dress, and Ariana gave us a knowing smile, commenting on our early start. Without missing a beat, I quipped, "Well, maybe you and Jack should be the ones getting a room." She just smirked, grabbed her clutch, and we all headed out the door. At the club, we met up with Jack, and I could tell he hadn't expected the night to start like this. As I shook his hand, I gave it a solid squeeze. Years of powerlifting had given me a strong grip, and I could see the surprise in his eyes as I held on just a little too long. Jack's knees started to buckle, and I finally let go of his hand, watching him try to mask the pain without whimpering. He was one of those guys who tries to look macho but just ends up as more of a pretty boy. You know the type, the kind that seems to think they're living in a cologne ad. There's something funny about how the closer a guy gets to that ideal look, the more likely he is to have a job as a hairdresser or, God forbid, end up in Scientology. Studying Jack, I couldn't help but notice a resemblance to Tom Cruise. So, just for fun, I asked, "Jack, you're not a hairdresser by any chance, are you?" He chuckled and dismissed it, saying that hairdressers were mostly gay. I laughed, telling him I'd actually been part of Scientology for a short time, trying to test a theory I had about pretty boys. Mila nearly lost it. She'd heard my crazy theories before and was ready to burst out laughing. Ariana, on the other hand, looked like she was about to explode. Seeing her reaction, I figured I'd better back off a bit. So Mila suggested we find a booth. She marched off, Jack following her with a tense expression, clearly trying to avoid any more of my remarks. Once we were safely out of earshot, Mila finally burst into laughter, and I joined her. "You're a mean man, Lucas," she said, grinning. "Yeah, well, it's been that kind of night," I replied, nudging her as I reminded her to play along with the act. Mila was a natural, and by the time we reached the booth, she charmed me so thoroughly that I nearly forgot why we were even there. We danced twice, with Mila keeping things just shy of overly intimate, leaving me feeling captivated. Meanwhile, Ariana and Jack were off in their own world. When we returned to the booth, I leaned over to Mila and whispered, "Ready for the big show?" She looked into my eyes, and for the first time, I sensed that this wasn't just a game for her. Her radiant brown eyes seemed to pull me in, and as she parted her full lips, moistening them just slightly, I couldn't resist. I leaned in and kissed her. It was electric, exceeding any expectations I had. Suddenly, we were interrupted as Ariana and Jack slid back into the booth. "Oh no," I exclaimed, mimicking an old Saturday Night Live skit. Look who's back. Mila caught the reference and chuckled. But Jack sat there clueless while Ariana's face puffed up like a blowfish, her smug expression gone in an instant. I seized the moment, telling them that Mila and I were heading out, suggesting they enjoy themselves. Ariana quickly followed us to the door, asking if I was okay and making a snide comment about me, acting like an idiot earlier. I took a deep breath and turned to her, trying one last time to reach her. I'm not okay, I told her, urging her to come with me. Why don't we leave now and go home, Ariana? We can work things out. I warned her that if she stayed, she'd be making a choice she couldn't take back. But she only smiled, telling me this night would be amazing for us, and that I needed to relax and enjoy myself. Don't be an idiot, Lucas, she said, brushing me off. I shot back. Don't be so sure it's me being the idiot here, Ariana. Ariana hinted that I should be excited about Mila's interest in me, emphasizing how great this experience would be. She grabbed my arm, smiling slyly, and promised it would all work out if I just let go. I teased her right back, suggesting she spend her energy on Mr. Jack and questioning if he even had the stamina for her plans. She hesitated, then casually mentioned she'd probably be home around midnight, clearly expecting her night to heat up with him. I slapped my forehead dramatically, pretending to be thoughtful. Just remember to be quiet if Mila and I are still occupied when you get back. She laughed and kissed me, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew it would be the last kiss between us. I walked away, heading out to where Mila was waiting in the car. When I climbed in, Mila looked at me seriously and asked if I was sure I was ready to go through with this. After all those years, she said softly, I thought you'd be more upset. I let out a long sigh, admitting that my emotional energy had been drained. I've been upset for so long that I've got nothing left in me to give to this, I told her. I've cried over it, wrestled with it, and now it's just time to move on. When we pulled up to the house, the moving truck was already there, and the girls were busy hauling their clothes and packing them into big tubs. We decided to take only the essentials, the bed from the master suite, the girls' beds, their TVs, and a few electronics, including the big screen TV we'd bought just 6 months ago. Once the packing was done, Mila drove the girls to our new place, which I'd chosen specifically to stay within their school district but as far from the old neighborhood as possible. When the movers finished loading, I took a last, lingering look around the empty house. Memories hung in the silence. 19 years of laughter, arguments, and family moments. I slipped off my wedding ring, placing it on the kitchen table beside my cell phone. The girls' phones were there too, signaling we were truly leaving. I allowed myself a few quiet words in my head, directed at Ariana and Mr. Jack, before I walked out the door, locking up behind me and loading my tools into the truck. At the new house, the girls' spirits were high. They couldn't wait to dive into the backyard pool. You like that, baby? I asked Serena as she looked around, beaming. Yeet, she replied. I had no clue what yeet meant, but it sounded like a positive endorsement. Mila, as usual, looked stunning, but I was too drained to give it much thought. Even if she'd been Jennifer Lawrence, I couldn't have mustered more than a nod. She seemed to sense my exhaustion, giving me a dazzling smile and a quick peck on the cheek before heading off. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air after she left, the only reminder of her presence as I settled into the quiet of our new life. That night, I went to bed and, surprisingly, slept. Maybe not deeply, but enough to feel a small measure of peace. The next morning, I got up and made coffee, and the girls joined me after a while. We had Danish Kringle and chocolate milk for breakfast as they watched cartoons till noon. By the time the afternoon sun was shining bright, those two little bundles of energy were splashing around in the pool in their swimsuits, laughing and shouting as I lounged nearby. Watching them, my mind wandered to what Ariana might be doing right now. I imagined she was probably frantic, calling everyone she could think of to track us down. But she was going to have a tough time finding us. It was summer vacation, so the girls weren't in school, and since I'd sold my business, I wasn't working either. I'd managed to sell it for a good amount, so we didn't need much. We were keeping a low profile, only going out to the grocery store, and I always made sure to walk or take the bus. The truck stayed parked in the garage. I figured she'd have probably gone to the police, claiming I'd taken the girls, but without a car or any traceable travel, we were hard to find. The only way she could try to reach us was online. Over the next couple of weeks, she flooded our inboxes with messages, tagged the girls on social media, and sent desperate tweets and Instagram DMs. The girls and I read them but didn't reply. I wanted her to figure out the hard way that we weren't coming back. About 3 weeks later, while I was at the grocery store, a private detective approached me, introducing himself and confirming my identity. Right away, I knew Ariana had sent him. He told me he planned to report my location to her and hinted that things might get rough if I didn't call her myself. He even threw out a vague threat about accusing me of stalking if he saw me around town. I kept calm, brushed him off, and told him he could go ahead and take a hike. I had no intention of contacting her. But it didn't end there. A couple of days later, the police showed up, thanks to a story Ariana had apparently spun about me kidnapping the girls. They asked me to come down to the station to clear things up. When I refused, they arrested me and took me downtown. The girls were driven in another car, and when we arrived at the station, I saw Ariana waiting there. She reached out, trying to hug the girls, but they pushed her away, glaring at her. The officers separated us, escorting the girls into one room with Ariana while they led me to another. They started grilling me, treating me like a criminal. I handed over my ID, pointed out that they already had my driver's license, and informed them that I wasn't answering any questions without a lawyer present. They scowled, one muttering something about me lawyering up, but they had no choice but to give me a phone. I called my attorney, Mark Chandler, who arrived in under an hour. With Mark there, everything took about 3 more hours to clear up. The girls confirmed that they'd come with me willingly, and they firmly denied any accusations of kidnapping. They refused to speak to their mother alone, insisting they wanted to stay with me. Mark took over, calmly pointing out that there was no court order on custody and that, under Georgia law, both parents were equal candidates for custody. He also reminded them that kids over 14 had the right to choose which parent they wanted to live with. With the legalities on our side, the authorities had no choice but to let us go. Mila walked out with the girls, while Ariana trailed behind, desperately begging them to talk to her. The girls just climbed into Mila's car and drove off, leaving Ariana and me alone in the parking lot. Ariana was a wreck, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and fell to her knees. I felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe, but I pushed it down. "Remember how I begged you not to mess around with Jack?" I asked. "Well, you didn't listen then, so why should I listen now?" She kept pleading, her voice hoarse, begging me not to treat her like this, telling me how sorry she was. After a long silence, I agreed to talk and asked her where she wanted to go. She begged to go home, saying she didn't want anyone to see her in this state. I wasn't about to step foot in her house, knowing who she'd been spending time with there, so I suggested going to my place instead. She hesitated, then nodded, saying, "Okay, Lucas, whatever you want. But remember, it's your home too." She suggested I ride with her, but I declined, calling a cab instead. She followed me to the house, knowing the girls would be with Mila for the night. Once we were inside, I handed her a cup of coffee, and we sat at the kitchen bar. The silence between us felt heavy, the kind that makes the air hard to breathe. I couldn't remember a time it had felt this awkward, not since maybe our 3rd date years ago. Eventually, she broke the silence, asking me what I wanted. I snapped back. Did I say I wanted anything? She softened her tone, asking what she needed to do to get me to come back home and see the girls again. I told her I had no control over her relationship with the girls. That was up to them. She accused me of turning them against her and hinted that maybe Sophie had fed me poisonous ideas. I raised an eyebrow. Is Sophie some kind of all-knowing oracle now? I asked, keeping my voice steady. For the record, I didn't say anything to the girls about you. The only thing I told them was that I was leaving and they needed to decide who they wanted to stay with. When she pressed me on who could have told them, I leaned forward, looking her right in the eyes. You did, Ariana. That night in the living room when you threatened me. The girls were sitting on the stairs, listening to every word. Her face went pale as the realization sank in, and she started sobbing, unable to hold back. I told her that, in the girl's eyes, she had destroyed their perception of her, and that I shared that belief. Her pleas were desperate, like a mirror of my own feelings from months ago. I looked at her, my voice cold, and told her I was indifferent to her regrets with the girls. "You made this mess," I said flatly, "and now you're the one who has to fix it." She asked what could be done about us, and I didn't hesitate. "File for divorce," I told her simply. Ariana insisted she didn't want a divorce, saying she just wanted me to come home. I made it clear that I was already home. I had no plans to live with her again. She apologized, admitting she'd made a mistake by pushing me into this mess, and pleaded for forgiveness, suggesting we could see a marriage counselor or therapist together. I told her that wasn't the issue. It wasn't about what I wanted. It was about the fact that she'd already shown she didn't want the same things I did. I demanded that she file for divorce and warned that if she didn't initiate it within a few months, I would. I laid it out plainly. I wanted nothing to do with her, and our relationship was beyond repair. She became furious, accusing me of being a fool and taking all our money by selling the business and emptying our bank accounts. I defended my actions, explaining that I'd sold the business at a significant loss and only took what I had earned. Besides, I added, I don't have a cent of it left. That was partly true. I had moved the funds to a secure offshore account, knowing it was essential to protect those assets before the divorce process began. The sale record showed I'd sold the business to a Danish company for less than my tax obligations, with extra funds paid to the IRS to cover future liabilities. Meanwhile, our brokerage accounts remained untouched, though I knew I'd eventually have to split those assets. To ensure the girls' financial security, I'd set up a trust that would cover their needs for the next few years. I had also quietly built up a cash reserve over the past few weeks. Every time I visited a grocery store, Walmart, or convenience store, I used my debit card and took cash back, anywhere from $60 to $200 each time. This strategy added up quickly, and I stored the cash in an old chest in a storage unit, ready for when it might be needed. Returning to our discussion, I told Ariana she could keep the house. The equity was more than enough for her to sell, pay off the mortgage, and have a buffer to get by. I even suggested she might consider moving in with Mr. Jack, casually musing about how his wife might react to that. Her face went pale. "I didn't know he was married," she stammered, looking stunned. "Your desire for an open marriage made it clear you didn't care much about anyone's marital status," I replied coldly. I told her once again that it was time to let go and file for divorce. As I got up to leave, Ariana followed me, visibly shaken, wringing her hands and crying. At the door, she stopped, looking at me with tear-filled eyes, desperately searching my face for any hint of forgiveness or warmth. Ariana looked at me, eyes red and full of regret, and asked if I would tell the girls she loved them and was sorry. I agreed to pass on the message but reminded her that I wasn't the one who'd given up. I wasn't filing for divorce because, deep down, I didn't want one. I wanted her to come home to us, to the family we'd built. She shook her head, calling me closed-minded, and said she regretted not seeing this coming. She insisted that she loved me and wanted to keep trying. But I was drained, too exhausted to argue any further. I saw her out, took a few minutes to gather myself, then called Mila to bring the girls back home. Mila didn't come in, sensing the tension, but the girls walked in even more upset with their mother than they'd been before. I could tell that any mention of Ariana's message would only stir up more frustration, so I decided to hold off on it for the time being. 2 days later, Ariana showed up again, this time around 4:30, carrying dinner, chicken tetrazzini with French-cut green beans, and a huge basket of garlic bread. When Elena answered the door, Ariana tried to hug her, but Elena stiff-armed her, stopping her in her tracks. Ariana greeted me, calling me baby, but Elena called out for my attention right away. I heard Ariana apologizing, professing her love, and saying how much she missed us, but Elena wouldn't have it. She cut her mother off, telling her to stay away, refusing to listen. Ariana's face crumpled as she staggered a bit, almost collapsing from the hurt. I took the basket of food from her hands and gently guided her to the sofa, where she buried her face in her hands, sobbing about how hated she felt. I nodded, acknowledging that what she'd done had hurt the girls deeply, and I doubted they'd ever trust her the same way again. Though I did feel sorry for her, I reminded her that rebuilding any relationship with the girls was her responsibility, not theirs, and certainly not mine. She looked up at me, pleading, as she mentioned the dinner she'd prepared. Despite everything, I decided to help bridge the gap and offered to talk to the girls. While she went to the kitchen to set up, I went upstairs. The girls were fuming. Serena was livid, saying that Ariana had destroyed our family and that bringing food didn't change anything. I sympathized with her, explaining that Ariana had thrown a grenade into our lives and now had to deal with the aftermath. I reassured them that my love for them was unwavering and that they were free to choose whether to stay with me or with their mother, emphasizing that they'd always have my support. Elena, refusing to sit down with her mother, said bitterly, "I'd rather die than eat with her." Both girls reaffirmed their choice to stay with me, and we hugged. I suggested that they try to come downstairs and eat with Ariana, just to keep things civil. Elena looked at me and asked, "Is that really what you want?" I nodded, telling her that civility was all I expected from them. They didn't need to pretend, just to avoid being cruel. Reluctantly, they agreed. Dinner was intensely awkward. Ariana tried to engage them in conversation, but they only gave short, one-word responses. After the meal, we quietly cleaned up, packed up Ariana's dishes, and avoided eye contact. When it was time for Ariana to leave, she asked Serena for a hug. Serena stared at her, cold and distant, and said, "You're not my mother anymore." Without another word, both girls turned and went to their rooms, shutting the door on any chance for reconciliation that night. Ariana was crushed. It took her a full half-hour to compose herself enough to walk out. Despite feeling a flicker of pity, I couldn't shake a certain satisfaction in seeing her face the consequences of her choices. I hadn't created this situation, and it felt right that she was finally beginning to understand the damage she'd done. Ariana continued to come over about once a week, clinging to hope each time that something would change, but every visit ended the same. The girls were distant, refusing to open up or show her any warmth. Still, she never filed for divorce, always trying to convince me to come back. After 6 months of this, I finally took matters into my own hands and filed. When the divorce was finalized, it seemed that reality hit her for the first time. Our marriage was truly over. The court granted her visitation rights, but each time she scheduled a visit, some obstacle seemed to arise. The girls grew accustomed to life without her, and I hoped she'd eventually find someone who shared her vision of an open lifestyle. Meanwhile, I remained single, choosing to dedicate my life solely to my daughters, making sure they had the stable family they needed.